The first time my husband told me I had no place in his daughter's life. He said it loud enough for the whole dinner table to go silent and quiet enough that he had no idea those words were about to cost him more than he could afford. I was standing in our kitchen in eastern Tennessee, casserole dish in my hands, when Frank leaned back in his chair and said, "She's not your child. Linda, stay out of it." For a moment, nobody moved. The ceiling fan clicked overhead. Cicadas buzzed outside in the July heat, and a pickup truck rumbled down the county road behind our house. Across from us, 16-year-old Emily kept staring at her phone, pretending she hadn't heard a thing, but she had. We all had. The argument started because her school principal had called me that afternoon. Emily had skipped class and driven to Knoxville with 2 friends, and because Frank was working a construction job nearly 3 hours away, I was the one who abandoned my grocery cart and drove to pick her up. I waited until dinner to bring it up, believing we would handle it as a family. That was apparently my mistake. "She already has parents," Frank said, reaching for his sweet tea. "You don't need to correct her." I sat down without answering because, at 63, I had lived long enough to know that angry people often reveal what they truly think. The truth was, I had spent 7 years helping raise Emily. Her mother had moved to Florida when Emily was 9, drifting in and out of birthdays and school plays. And I was the one who packed lunches, attended parent-teacher conferences, and sat beside hospital beds during childhood fevers. I never asked her to call me Mom, and I never tried to replace anyone. I simply stepped into the empty spaces life had left behind. Frank used to thank me for that. Somewhere along the way, he stopped. The next morning, I carried my coffee onto the porch and sat on the old wooden swing while fresh cut. Grass drifted through the yard, and the screen door banged shut behind me. Then I opened a yellow legal pad and began writing down every expense I had covered for our family. By lunchtime, I had filled 3 pages, and before the weekend was over, I had made a decision that Frank would not understand until it was far too late. By Sunday evening, that yellow legal pad was still sitting on the kitchen counter, covered with numbers I never imagined I would one day have to count. Mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries, Emily's braces, dance lessons, school trips, car insurance. The more I wrote, the more I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being Frank's wife and become the person quietly holding his entire household together. I wasn't bitter about the money itself. I had worked for 34 years as a nurse at our county hospital, picking up extra shifts whenever I could and putting away a little from every paycheck. Frank worked hard too. At least that was what I had always believed, and I never minded helping. Families help each other. That's how I was raised. But as I sat there listening to the old coffee maker hum and watching the evening light fade through the kitchen window, one thought kept returning to me. If Emily truly wasn't my responsibility, then neither were the bills that came with raising her. Early Monday morning, while Frank had already left for work, I drove to the local credit union just outside town. The young woman behind the desk greeted me by name and asked how my retirement was treating me. I smiled politely and told her I needed to make a few changes to my accounts. Within an hour, I had opened a new checking account in my name alone, transferred my savings, and canceled every automatic payment connected to our household. The mortgage would now come from Frank's account. So would the utilities, the insurance, the phone bill, and Emily's expenses. I didn't announce what I had done. I simply came home, watered my tomato plants, folded the laundry, and made dinner as though nothing had changed. For the next few days, Frank didn't notice a thing. He came home tired, kicked off his boots, and settled into his recliner while Emily disappeared into her room. Then, on Friday afternoon, my phone rang while I was buying groceries. It was the woman from Emily's dance studio, calling to say that the monthly payment had been declined. I apologized and told her she would need to contact Frank. 2 hours later, he walked into the kitchen holding an envelope from the electric company, confusion written all over his face. But that notice was only the beginning, because 3 days later, something arrived in our mailbox that made him turn pale. Frank stood in the middle of the kitchen holding the envelope. I was rinsing dishes at the sink when he cleared his throat and read the letter a second time. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the trees, and the crickets had already started up. Emily sat at the table doing homework, though from the way she kept glancing over her notebook, I could tell she was listening to every word. The insurance company canceled the policy on Emily's truck, Frank finally said. I dried my hands on a towel and nodded. That's unfortunate, he frowned. Did you know this was coming? I turned back to the sink. I knew I wasn't paying for it anymore. The room went quiet. Frank stared at me for a long moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had heard. "Linda, what exactly is going on?" he asked. I looked him in the eye for the first time all week. I assumed that if I wasn't supposed to have a say in raising your daughter, then you would prefer to handle the responsibilities yourself. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but neither of us looked at her. Frank muttered something under his breath, grabbed the letter, and stepped out onto the porch. Through the window, I watched him pace back and forth beneath the porch light with his phone pressed to his ear. He looked worried now, and I couldn't help noticing that worry had arrived much faster than gratitude ever had. The next morning, I met my old friend Carol at the diner across from the county courthouse. We had worked together at the hospital for nearly 30 years, and she could tell something was wrong before I even sat down. "You look tired," she said, sliding a cup of coffee toward me. I laughed softly. Marriage will do that. After I told her what Frank had said, she leaned back and shook her head. Bless his heart. That man has some nerve. I shrugged. I'm not trying to punish anyone. Carol studied me for a moment. Then what are you trying to do? I looked out the window at the courthouse steps across the street. Figure out the truth. On my way home, I stopped by our local bank to ask for copies of several old statements. Some of the numbers in our accounts had stopped making sense months earlier, and I wanted answers. The clerk disappeared into a back office and returned carrying a thick folder. Then she opened it, glanced down at the paperwork, and asked me a question that changed everything. "Mrs. Carter, were you aware that your husband opened a line of credit against your home 5 years ago?" The bank clerk asked, lowering her voice as she slid the folder across the desk. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. The lobby around me carried on as usual, the printer humming in the corner, customers chatting near the entrance, the smell of old paper hanging in the air, but all I could focus on was the stack of documents in front of me. I opened the folder and stared at page after page of records bearing Frank's signature. The loan amount alone made my stomach tighten. I knew nothing about it, yet as I traced the dates with my finger, I realized that many of the monthly payments had quietly come from the joint account. I had spent years funding with my nursing, salary, and retirement savings. I sat in my car afterward with the air conditioner running and the papers spread across the passenger seat, trying to understand how 7 years of marriage had brought me to a bank parking lot, questioning everything I thought I knew about my husband. Frank and I had never been wealthy. We lived in the same modest Tennessee house we bought after our wedding, spent Sundays at church, and ate dinner at the same family restaurant every anniversary. I had always believed we were building a stable life together. But now, looking at those statements, I wasn't so sure. That evening, Frank acted as though nothing had happened. He laughed at something on television, asked Emily about school, and complained that gas prices had gone up again. Not once did he mention the loan. Not once did he ask whether I had found anything at the bank. By morning, I had made up my mind. Instead of driving home after grocery shopping, I parked outside an attorney's office near the county courthouse. The building was old with faded carpet, heavy wooden furniture, and shelves lined with dusty law books. A gray-haired attorney named Walter. Walker listened patiently as I explained everything and handed him the documents. He adjusted his glasses, studied the statements in silence, and finally pulled one sheet from the pile. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, tapping several withdrawals with his pen, "do you recognize where this money was sent?" I leaned forward and shook my head. Mr. Walker folded his hands and looked directly at me. "Because according to these records, your husband has been transferring thousands of dollars every year to someone else." Then he paused before asking a question that turned my entire marriage upside down. "Has Frank ever spoken to you about his brother's financial troubles?" I recognized the company name on the paperwork before Mr. Walker even finished his sentence. Frank's younger brother, Randy, owned a small construction business in Western Tennessee that never seemed to find its footing. Every Thanksgiving and every Christmas, Randy arrived with the same tired promises about how the next year would finally turn things around. There was always another delayed contract, another piece of equipment that needed replacing, another explanation for why money was tight. Frank defended him every single time. "Family takes care of family," he used to say. And for years, I believed that was exactly what we were doing. Sitting in that attorney's office, however, I learned the truth. While I had been paying the mortgage, The utility bills, Emily's braces, dance lessons, groceries, and practically every expense that kept our household running, Frank had quietly poured nearly $80,000 into. Randy's failing business without telling me. I drove home in complete silence, passing old barns, church signs, and gravel roads I had known for decades. When I walked through the front door, Frank was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through another stack of unpaid bills. He looked up and said, "We need to talk." I pulled the folder from my purse and set it down in front of him. "I think we do." For the first time in our marriage, I laid every document on the table between us. Frank tried to explain that Randy had promised to repay him, that the business had almost recovered more than once, and that he had only hidden the loans because he did not want to worry me. I listened quietly. Years earlier, I might have argued, but I had lived long enough to know that explanations and excuses are rarely the same thing. When he finally stopped talking, I asked him only one question. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" Frank lowered his eyes and stared at the paperwork. He never answered. In the months that followed, I worked with Mr. Walker to protect my retirement, savings, and separate my finances completely. Emily eventually learned the truth as well. To her credit, she stopped treating me like an outsider and started asking difficult questions of her father. Frank was never publicly humiliated, and I never wanted revenge. But in a small town, folks notice more than people think, and little by little, people understood exactly what had happened. These days, I still sit on my porch every evening with a glass of sweet tea beside me, grateful for the peace I almost lost, because I finally learned that when someone tells you where you stand in their life, you should believe them the first time.